I didn't get a warning, a meeting, or a polite letter. I got cold metal clamped around my wrists on my own front porch, while HOA Karen stood at the bottom of my steps like she was unveiling a statue of herself. The sun was bright, the street was quiet, and two men in bargain bin uniforms pretended they were the law as they snapped those cuffs shut and recited lines they clearly learned from a bad TV show. They didn't know who I was, and HOA Karen was counting on that. Her grin stretched so wide it looked painful, like she'd waited her entire life for this exact performance and wasn't going to miss a single second of applause, even if it only came from herself. She wasn't interested in order, safety, or community. She was interested in theater, and she thought I was the prop she was going to break in front of an audience of blinds and drawn curtains. They threw around phrases like bylaws violation and non-compliance, trying to sound official, trying to imitate authority the way a child imitates adulthood by wearing a parent's shoes, wobbling and convinced it looks convincing. I stayed silent because silence terrifies people who live off reaction. She wanted pleading. She wanted panic. She wanted me to crumble so she could feel 10 feet tall. Instead, she got something she didn't recognize at all: composure. That was the first crack in her fantasy. The men in the fake badges shifted, uncertain, because they were rehearsed for outrage, not stillness. And the neighbors behind the glass learned something too. They weren't watching justice. They were watching a woman's ego chew through the last restraints of shame. I felt the humiliation, yes, because anyone would. Because having your hands cuffed on your porch is intimate and public at the same time, a violation and a spectacle in one. But underneath the humiliation was something heavier and much calmer, the understanding that she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. She didn't see a line at all. She saw a stage. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and delivered lines with a sugary venom that dripped off every word as she announced that this was what happened when people think the rules don't apply to them. What she meant was simple. This is what happens when people don't bow to me. Every second of it was about ownership, and she thought she owned this street, owned these people, owned me. I watched the neighborhood become complicit through the fear, not because they were bad, but because bullies feed on good people's exhaustion. Curtains trembled. A face disappeared. A door that had been open closed quietly. She mistook their fear for loyalty, and my silence for defeat, because that's how small tyrants think. They only know how to read the world when it obeys. The two pretending to be officers shifted their weight and tightened the cuffs like they were doubling down on a lie that was unraveling in their own hands. They demanded I acknowledge her authority, her office, her position, words she clung to like flotation devices in deep water. She thought the costume made the character. She thought the title made the throne. She thought paper made power. So I gave her exactly what she wanted least. The truth, delivered without drama, without volume, without anything she could twist. I told them who I was. I didn't shout it. I didn't puff my chest. I said it the way you say your own name to someone who has just mispronounced it for the last time. Chief of Police. Their faces changed before their bodies did. One went blank, the other went pale. The neighbors who had disappeared from their windows reappeared like the street itself, inhaled again after holding its breath too long. HOA Karen didn't blink at first, because the brain takes a moment to accept that the world doesn't revolve around it. Then the change came, like a shadow passing over the sun. The smirk collapsed. The clipboard lowered. It wasn't fear at first. It was disbelief that reality had dared contradict her. She tried to smile again and found she couldn't remember how. The fake authority on my wrists was still there, but the real authority in the air flipped instantly. Nobody moved, and nobody needed to. Power had changed rooms without a sound. She had sent fake cops to arrest a man she thought was another resident she could grind under her heel, and instead, she was standing there, realizing she had staged her little parade in front of the one person in the entire city who knew the difference between law and cosplay down to the bone. She opened her mouth and closed it again. Her brain searched frantically for a script and found nothing but static. The two men in costume stood frozen in a silence so thick it felt like weather. For the first time since she'd crowned herself queen of this cul-de-sac empire, no one rushed to obey the sound of her voice. For the first time, everyone saw through it. I didn't need to raise mine. I didn't need to threaten, posture, or move. All I had to do was exist as myself in the space where she had been pretending to rule, and her fantasy collapsed under its own ridiculous weight. The handcuffs were still tight, but they no longer humiliated me. They humiliated her, because every neighbor peering out now understood exactly what this moment was. A narcissist caught mid-performance, stripped of audience control, standing face to face with someone immune to her imaginary throne. She tried to talk, to accuse, to pivot, but every word sounded smaller than the last. Because when counterfeit power meets the real thing, it doesn't go out with a bang. It flickers. It sputters. It dies in silence while everyone watches. I did not earn calm by accident. I bled my way to it through years that taught me exactly what power is and what it is not. And none of those years involved clipboards, made-up bylaws, or the brittle theatrics of someone like HOA Karen pretending that control is the same thing as leadership. My life before this quiet street was a long hallway of sirens, briefing rooms, next of kin notifications, courtrooms where justice limped but still tried to stand, and offices where every decision weighed enough to bend a man's spine if he didn't learn how to carry it. I spent decades watching what happens when authority is misused, and when it is necessary, when it saves lives, and when it turns into a weapon for small people desperate to feel big. I learned that the uniform doesn't grant integrity, and a badge doesn't manufacture a conscience, and that is why her brand of counterfeit power disgusted me in a way few things ever have. I had commanded people who would run toward things everyone else ran away from, and I had also seen people who wanted status without responsibility, spotlight without duty, obedience without merit. And the second category was always more dangerous in the long run, because they didn't care who they broke as long as they were noticed. That is why I moved here, not to be saluted, not to be asked for stories, not to play the elder statesman of some suburban myth, but to sit in a house that finally did not need defending, to hear silence at night that wasn't simply the brief pause between crises, to live somewhere that claimed to value normalcy and peace over noise and ego. I unpacked my boxes alone, set down framed memories that were equal parts love and loss, and told myself that this was the last chapter, that the revolving door of emergencies had finally stopped spinning for me. I thought I had walked far enough away from arenas where people confuse control with purpose. The irony is almost comedic. After a career full of genuine danger, what tried to invade my peace wasn't a criminal empire or a violent street crew, but a woman with a title she'd stapled to herself like a name tag, and a hunger to be the loudest person in every room she walked into. The first time I read her violation notice, that red sheet blaring self-importance, I recognized the handwriting of petty tyranny immediately, the same pattern I used to see on a larger scale in people who believed rules existed for others, but never for them. She wasn't defending standards. She was building a stage. My authority did not come from shouting, threats, or documents, and it certainly did not come from a homeowners association presidency invented from thin air. It came from years of accountability, from sitting with consequences, from standing in front of people when things went wrong and saying the blame stops here. That is the part that terrified her the most, though she couldn't have articulated it if she tried. Real authority doesn't need theatrics, and real authority doesn't need to humiliate anyone to exist, and she had built her entire personality around the opposite. As I watched her throw her weight around the neighborhood in those early weeks, dictating aesthetics like they were commandments, mistaking discomfort for respect, mistaking compliance for admiration, I saw the same brittle foundation I'd seen in corrupt city officials, failed supervisors, and self-crowned kings of tiny domains. Beneath all the noise was fear. Fear of being ordinary, fear of being ignored, fear that if she wasn't in control, she was nothing at all. My past gave me something dangerous to people like her: patience. I did not rush to confront her because I didn't need to win a moment. I needed to understand the pattern, the harm, the way her behavior rippled through homes she didn't live in and lives she didn't care about. Years in command taught me that the loudest person in the room usually has the least to say, and that the people worth listening to rarely need to raise their voice. She expected resistance to look like shouting, slamming doors, dramatic speeches in driveways. Instead, she met stillness, documentation, and the kind of attention that doesn't blink or break. My backstory is not decoration. It is the reason this entire situation unfolded the way it did. Because she thought she was the first storm I had ever seen, and I had spent a lifetime standing in hurricanes. She thought she had discovered power. I had lived long enough to know that power is simply responsibility, wearing uncomfortable shoes. By the time she tried to turn my porch into her stage, my life had already taught me the most important lesson about people like HOA Karen. They can only function when everyone around them agrees to the illusion, and I was done agreeing. What made HOA Karen dangerous wasn't the paper she waved or the phony titles she loved to recite. It was the way she constructed a tiny universe where she sat at the center and everyone else slowly, almost unknowingly, revolved around her. Like hers doesn't arrive overnight. It creeps, it drips, it seeps under doors, and by the time people realize it has flooded the room, their feet are already wet. She started small, the way petty tyrants always do, by pretending to organize and help and standardize, using words that sound benevolent while building a throne out of favors, gossip, and intimidation. She learned who hated conflict and leaned on them, learned who liked proximity to control and rewarded them, learned who stayed silent when others were pushed, and treated their silence as consent. She called meetings where she sat at the head of the table like a monarch at a banquet, talked in circles until people nodded out of exhaustion, and turned normal neighbors into reluctant subjects whose lives were measured in infractions she invented and standards she alone could interpret. The structure of her power wasn't complicated, it was insidious. She positioned herself as the interpreter of community values, which really meant her preferences dressed up as law. She surrounded herself with people who didn't necessarily respect her, but feared her ability to make their lives miserable. And for someone like her, fear is better than respect anyway. She ran on complaint energy, feeding on whispers and anonymous notes, pitting one neighbor against another so no one ever felt safe enough to challenge her directly. It wasn't just the fines or the letters, it was the feeling of being watched by someone who enjoyed watching. I saw the aftermath everywhere once I knew where to look. Gardens suddenly torn up because they were declared non-conforming. Paint colors chosen out of fear rather than taste. Children told not to leave bikes in driveways because a woman with a camera phone and a hunger for authority couldn't stand the sight of joy she didn't control. She talked constantly about standards, but the only real consistent standard was submission. Those who praised her were granted invisible immunity. Those who questioned her were buried under paperwork and threats of action. The worst part was not her behavior. It was the way decent people shrank themselves to avoid her attention, laughing nervously in her presence, apologizing for existing too loudly on their own property. She mistook their careful politeness for proof that she was right, never understanding that what she ruled was not respect, but a landscape of tension, where everyone waited for the next arbitrary rule to shape their day. And then there were the people she truly hurt, the ones she didn't just inconvenience but crushed under the weight of her invented authority. I heard stories of elderly residents who paid fake fines because stress made them afraid to argue, of widows who cried over letters written in bold fonts and legal-sounding language that had no real force, but carried emotional weight heavy enough to bend their backs. She enjoyed the meetings where she addressed violations, savoring the way people's voices trembled as they tried to defend themselves, while she interrupted, corrected, and scolded like a petty dictator presiding over a ceremony of public embarrassment. She didn't care about property values. She cared about personal supremacy, about walking down the street knowing people stiffened when they saw her, about feeling tall in the shallowest possible way. The power structure she built relied on three things: her certainty, their fear, and everyone else's silence. Remove any one of those and the entire thing collapses. But until then it stands, brittle yet functional, like a rotten beam holding up a house no one wants to inspect too closely. I recognized how carefully she had conditioned the neighborhood to accept her as an inevitability. New residents were greeted not with warmth, but with welcome packets that felt more like indictments waiting to happen. Longtime residents had learned how things work, which really meant they learned how to avoid provoking the monarch. She rewrote the story of the street so thoroughly that people forgot they ever had a right to simply live without seeking permission from someone who had no legal claim to offer it. Standing in the middle of that machine, I saw clearly that this wasn't about grass height or trash cans or paint tones. It was about one person's obsession with control turning into a culture where everyone else learned to live smaller, quieter, more carefully than any free person should ever have to. That was her real abuse. Not just the money she extracted or the rules she fabricated, but the way she taught people to doubt their own autonomy. She convinced them the cage was community. The day I decided to stop merely enduring HOA Karen and start dismantling the fantasy she lived in was not marked by anger or shouting. It was marked by a very simple realization that the truth, once fully gathered and exposed, was more devastating than any argument I could ever make. I had watched her long enough to understand her patterns, listened long enough to hear the tremor in people's voices when they said her name, and seen enough of her paperwork theater to know that the only thing holding her kingdom together was the assumption that it was real. So I did what she never expected anyone to do. Her claims like they mattered enough to verify, because nothing frightens counterfeit authority more than being measured against actual legitimacy. Proof isn't loud. It is patient, meticulous, and immune to manipulation. And as I began quietly tracing the trail of her supposed power, it became obvious how fragile it really was. The titles she loved to repeat had no roots in law. The fines she mailed like threats drifting through mailboxes had no legal spine, and the organization she claimed to lead existed mostly in her head, and on paper she had formatted herself. I didn't need secret methods or cloak-and-dagger tactics. All I needed were public records, open conversations, and the courage other people had been shamed out of using. Doorways that had been closed by fear opened as soon as someone asked the right question without trembling. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact suddenly talked for hours once they felt safe. And in those stories, a pattern emerged so consistent it was almost mathematical. Intimidation, isolation, invented violations, escalating threats, and finally surrender. I saw bank statements where money flowed out under the label of fees and compliance charges, with no lawful authority behind them, just the heavy shadow of her voice telling people they had no choice. I saw letters written in language designed to frighten rather than inform, dripping with bold text and deadlines meant to crush rather than clarify. I held documents where her name appeared beside titles she had never been legally granted, signatures from people who signed, not because they agreed, but because they wanted the harassment to stop. Every page I read felt less like paperwork and more like a confession she had typed herself. But the most evidence was not ink. It was the human wreckage she left behind. I listened to a soft-spoken widow explain how she stopped gardening because every bloom felt like an invitation to another reprimand. I heard an older veteran's voice break as he admitted life, not because he wanted to move, but because he was tired of living under a microscope controlled by someone who enjoyed watching him squirm. I saw children learn early that the safest way to exist was to be invisible in their own yard. None of those stories were dramatic in the Hollywood sense, but they were devastating in the way that actually matters. Small cuts layered over time until people bled. That was the proof that mattered most to me. Not just that she had no legal authority, but that she had used the appearance of authority to rewrite how an entire community felt about itself. The final confirmation came like a door clicking shut. There was no registered authority giving life to the entity she pretended to rule. There was no lawful frame beneath the costume she wore so proudly. Her power wasn't just abusive, it was imaginary, and yet the damage it caused was painfully real, because fear doesn't require legitimacy to bite. Holding that truth in my hands was like holding a mirror I knew she would never willingly look into. The discovery phase was not exciting or dramatic. It was exact, undeniable, and heavy. I had dates, names, statements, records, testimonies, and most importantly, a community ready to stop whispering and start speaking in full voice. She had built her throne out of assumptions that no one would ever check, and I had checked every single one of them. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to embellish or exaggerate. The facts alone were humiliating enough to crack the persona she had wrapped herself in. What I held by the end was not merely evidence of wrongdoing. It was the complete story of how one person's ego had impersonated law and how easily fear had made that impersonation believable. And once you see exactly how a lie is built, you also see exactly how easily it can be taken apart. The moment of confrontation did not arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived with chairs scraping on a community room floor and the sound of people who had been quiet for too long finally deciding to show up. HOA Karen walked into that meeting like a queen entering court. Convinced the script was the same as every other time. She would lecture, they would nod, someone would cry, and she would leave feeling enormous. She didn't realize the room had changed. She didn't realize the air itself was different, thicker, heavier, charged with the kind of stillness that precedes a storm that doesn't need thunder. She took her usual seat at the head of the table, adjusted her stack of papers like props, and smiled a smile that had always worked before, the one that said, "I own this place," without ever using those words. What she didn't know was that this time, the room wasn't waiting for her to speak. It was waiting for her to be seen. I stood not because I needed attention, but because the truth deserved a spine. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I laid out the facts she never thought anyone would collect. The non-existent registration, the fictional authority, the fines with no lawful basis, the money funneled through fear, the letters written not to inform, but to intimidate. Every sentence was a mirror held steady in front of her, and every reflection stripped away a layer of the persona she had worn like armor. The neighbors she had trained to sit small in their chairs and apologize for breathing too loudly started to look up, first carefully, then directly. The shift. Shoulders straightened, eyes sharpened. The room wasn't bending around her anymore. It was closing in. She tried her familiar tricks, interrupting, scoffing, demanding order like a schoolteacher scolding children, but the authority she relied on had evaporated, and she didn't know how to function without it. She called me a liar, then a troublemaker, then a bully, throwing every label she had ever used on anyone who challenged her. But the labels slid to the floor because the documents on the table didn't respond to name-calling. They simply existed. People began to speak. First one, then another, then more. Their voices shaking at the beginning and growing steadier with every sentence. They talked about the embarrassment, the constant pressure of living beneath someone who treated their homes like territory she patrolled. They talked about money they paid, not because they believed they owed it, but because peace was worth more than truth when you're tired. They talked about shrinking their lives to fit inside her approval. And as each story broke the surface, you could see something in her eyes fracture. She wasn't losing control of the meeting. She was losing the illusion that she had ever had control of anything. Her allies, the ones who had nodded faithfully in the past, stared down at their hands or at the floor, unwilling to stand by the collapsing throne. The social scaffolding she had built from fear and pretense was coming apart one nail at a time. When I finally explained the involvement of legitimate authorities, of investigations that didn't answer to her voice or her theatrics, the room went completely silent, not with fear, but with the deep, resonant silence of understanding. It became unmistakable, undeniable, inescapable. The emperor of this cul-de-sac had never had clothes. She tried to laugh it off, tried to act insulted, tried to turn dramatic outrage into a shield, but it all looked like exactly what it was: desperation. Even her voice betrayed her, cracking around the edges where confidence used to sit. She wasn't the hunter anymore. She was the only person in the room still pretending there was a hunt at all. Collapse isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a woman realizing that no one is obeying her anymore. Sometimes it's a hand lowering a clipboard that suddenly weighs too much. Sometimes it's the way a room stops being afraid and starts being angry, then moves past anger into something colder, clarity. By the time the meeting ended, she wasn't dismissed. She was finished. Not by me, not by one dramatic gesture, but by the one thing she had never prepared for a community that had stopped believing in her. She walked out without looking at anyone, the queen leaving a kingdom that had quietly dissolved while she was still busy rehearsing speeches no one would ever listen to again. What followed was not revenge, not theatrics, showdown in the street. It was something far more terrifying to someone like HOA Karen, accountability carried out with calm precision. For years she had wielded imaginary authority like a club, so the arrival of real authority felt to her like a force of nature she could neither charm nor intimidate. Processes began moving that didn't care about her tone of voice, her outrage, or her endless need to be right. She was confronted not by raised voices, but by letters with seals, phone calls she couldn't control, questions that required answers instead of performances. She had spent so long faking structure that she never imagined what it would feel like to be measured by actual structure, the kind that doesn't bow or blink. The legal system she had pretended to embody finally turned its gaze toward her, and it did not find a powerful woman defending community standards. It found a person who had used fear as currency and fiction as policy. Investigations unfolded with an indifference that cut sharper than any insult. Where she once handed down decisions, she now sat in rooms where other people made them. Where she once called neighbors in to scold them, she now found herself called in to explain herself, and explanations crumble fast when the paper trail contradicts every practiced line. The money she extracted through intimidation was tracked, the titles she claimed were scrutinized, and the organization she worshipped as proof of her greatness was examined and declared for what it truly was, a construct held together by her ego and other people's silence. It didn't matter how loud she became. Real consequences don't respond to volume. The community she had fractured began to knit itself back together in her absence, and there was no place lonelier for her than a neighborhood finally remembering how to breathe without asking her permission. People repainted doors she had once forbidden, replanted gardens she had shamed, and sat on porches talking without scanning the street for her car. The retaliation she faced was not a punch. It was erasure from the role she had written for herself. Titles disappeared. Access evaporated. Influence turned to dust. Those who once stood beside her distanced themselves with practiced speed, suddenly remembering their spines now that hers had cracked. She was left with the one thing she could never weaponize: the truth about herself, laid bare in front of people who no longer had any reason to pretend. And while systems continued their slow, deliberate work, she had to live in the most punishing reality of all, a world where she wasn't important anymore. Victory didn't arrive with celebration. It arrived with ordinary life, finally returning to a place that should have always been ordinary in the first place. Lawns grew, were cut, grew again. Kids laughed too loudly without being shushed by imaginary regulations. Neighbors waved and actually meant it. No one rehearsed their every move to avoid attracting the attention of a self-appointed monarch. The absence of her shadow became the brightest thing on the street. She remained the same person, living in the same place, but her reign was over, dissolved without ceremony. People didn't confront her anymore. They didn't fear her. They didn't hate her with any fire. They simply stopped orienting their lives around her, which for someone like HOA Karen is the deepest possible humiliation. She existed without an audience, and the silence of that reality wrapped around her louder than any public shaming ever could. I didn't deliver a speech or carve a moral into the sky. I sat on my porch and watched a normal neighborhood be normal again, a place where rules returned to what they were always meant to be: shared understandings, not weapons. My role receded the way it was always meant to, back into quiet, back into the background, back into the simple fact of who I am, without the need to prove it. There was no dramatic final scene between us, because there didn't need to be one. The story ended the way real power struggles often do, with one person discovering they never actually had what they thought they did, and everyone else finally remembering they had it all along. In the end, there were no speeches, no applause, no dramatic music. There was only a street that no longer walked on eggshells, and a woman who had lost the only thing she ever truly cared about had the illusion that she mattered more than everyone else. And when it was finally, unquestionably over, there was no sound at all. HOA Karen went dead silent.